This is Peter the First. He is going to be the future Tsar of Russia. He's just your average prince, nothing too special about him. Pretty normal childhood, honestly. Sometimes he messed with his servants, played with his noble friends, participated in feasts, witnessed his family get thrown onto a pillar of pikes at the mere age of 10. Those sort of regular childhood occurrences. Yeah, but in all seriousness, Peter has a few issues to work through. But how did this all come to be? Well, Peter's father, Alexis of Russia, had 2 wives and 2 families. Peter's stepbrothers were in the line of succession before himself and his other siblings. However, his sister Sophia and his brother Fyodor III didn't exactly play by the rules. Fyodor snatched the crown for himself, but died a few years later, because of the laws of primogeniture, meaning men before women in terms of succession, and the fact that Ivan V, his half-brother, wasn't mentally fit to be king. Peter was to be crowned Tsar at the age of 10. But Sophia, unfortunately, was hungry for power, so she hatched a plot. The plan revolved around making a fuss that the Russian court basically just skipped over Ivan V's right to the throne. And when they ignored her complaints, she took advantage of a current army rebellion going on called the Streltsy Uprising, and got the rebellion to fight for Sophia and her allies. In the conflict, many of Peter's uncles and family friends were killed by that aforementioned pillar of pikes thing which Peter witnessed. Unfortunately for Sophia, she couldn't just make Peter disappear, since he was technically still the Tsar. So she convinced her allies to have Peter share the throne with his half-brother, while she would act as the regent of Russia, basically meaning she had all the power. After witnessing the following events, Peter became really distant from Russian culture and began a love for everything European in replace of that. Peter started hanging around the European immigrant villages outside of Moscow. There he learned about the Western fashion, culture, and lifestyle. He also had a great hunger for learning, and was a bit of a jack of all trades. In fact, that's what got me interested in him after first discovering him. He knew dentistry, metalworking, basic surgery, and even ship navigation. His hunger was so great that he did something few rulers before him considered: hiring foreign instructors. More importantly, he hired European military strategists. With the help of his new instructors, he learned the game of war. Because he was still Tsar, every whim of his had to be obeyed. So, he was able to gather a group of around 300 peasants strong and began training. He practiced army formations, sieges, artillery usage, and these weren't just make-pretend fights either. He was using real equipment in his practice. In one incident, he killed 30 people from cannon fire. What was his reaction? Bring me 30 more. This is a great sign that Peter is 100% totally mentally stable. Several years later, with his military training complete and standing at an intimidating 6 foot 8 inches, he overthrew his sister Sophia in a rather bloodiless conflict at the age of 17. He then forced her to live out the rest of her days in isolation as a nun in the church. However, he did no harm to his brother and let him remain co-Tsar. In return, Ivan let Peter hold all of the power. So with all of this power, what else do you do other than go to war? Just after 6 years into his reign, he began a conflict with the Ottoman Empire, and by the end of this war, he took hold of the province of Azov, or better known as Rostov today. This gave Russia a key port into the Black Sea. However, he did lose this territory just a few years later in a second conflict, but future rulers would take this territory back. During the war, Peter embarked on a trip to Europe throughout the years 1697 and 1698. He was completely blown away by the European way of life, and his obsession only deepened. But this trip wasn't just for Peter to have fun, it was also so that he could take back knowledge. During his trip, he learned more and more about ship design. He went to the Netherlands under the ingenious facade of "I'm not Peter the Great," and learned more about how to construct ships. He took home these blueprints and created a modern navy consisting of 48 ships and 800 galleys. Peter also brought back with him ideas, the European culture, and his citizens were going to westernize whether they wanted to or not. He forced his citizens to adopt European clothing, he made it mandatory for women to wear heels, imposed a tax on beards, which pissed off the Orthodox Church, and worst of all, he updated the Russian calendar to the Julian calendar. He wanted Russia to be European so much, in fact, that at one point he was considering abandoning the Russian language in its entirety and replace it with either Dutch or German. But why would Peter pick Dutch instead of a more widespread language like English? Well, he just really liked the Netherlands. He admired the small nation and how it was able to build up its own empire and not get conquered by the larger powers surrounding it. In the dawn of the 18th century, right after the war with the Ottoman Empire, Peter the Great started another conflict. He aimed his forces at the Swedish Empire and began the Great Northern War. The grueling 20-year fight was partaken to give Russia a chance for expansion into the Baltic Sea. During the war, his army took an unpromising marshland south of Finland, so Peter thought, well, better make a fort here. Then some advisor was like, but how do we do that? The land is just so awful. Peter's solution to this hiccup was a long-standing practice in Russian history. Throw men at the problem until it goes away. He sent thousands of peasants and prisoners of war to slave away, draining the marshland to build up a fort called St. Petersburg, which would one day become the second most populous city in Russia and its cultural center. And I want to take a slight detour for a moment and explain something that a lot of people don't understand about Russia nowadays. The nation, even after losing 1/4 of its territory with the collapse of the USSR, is still the largest country in the entire world. But despite this fact, it's very aggressive and land-hungry. Why is that? Well, it all comes down to geography. Most of the land can't be used for anything. Not mining, housing, farming, it's useless. And it's so cold in Russia that most of its ports freeze over for half the year. Even in our technologically advanced era, Russia still struggles to export its vast resources. Lacking decent ocean access on top of all the sanctions from the USA, its major land advantage can't be exported. That was one of the major motivators to annex the Crimea from Ukraine in 2014. It's also why the USSR wanted to invade Afghanistan in 1979. They wanted a permanent warm water port in the Indian Ocean so that they could export all of their resources across the entire world. Anyhow, back to the topic at hand. After a long but ultimately successful war with the Swedish Empire, with their Emperor Charles dying in a siege, Peter the Great was proclaimed Emperor of all Russia. He then spent his last year as ruler focusing on important reformation. In 1718, he established colleges and began creating new government departments like Foreign Affairs, War, Finance, and the Justice Department. The tax system also received a major overhaul, and he abolished the land tax and the household tax. He then ordered the construction of Palace Peterhof in St. Petersburg. In 1722, he established the Table of Ranks, which allowed military members and government officials to rise through the ranks based off their service to the emperor rather than solely by birth. Although birth was still an important factor, it was still an aristocracy. But this is all just boring ruler stuff that I put in so I can put the education tag on the video. Let's talk about something that Peter did that can only be described as uncool. The year was 1718. Peter was just doing his thing, probably thinking about Europe, when he was informed about a plot on his life. Turns out, oppressing and mocking his society's culture and its way of life made a few of them angry. Many military and government officials were involved, and even potentially some members of the church, seeing how Peter made them mad by maybe giving them nicknames based off of church positions. At the center of this conspiracy was his own son, Alexei Petrovich. After killing and interrogating all the conspirators, he needed to confront his son. He did what any father would do. He called him over, sat down with him, and then tortured him. Yes, he tortured his own child. He forced a confession out of him, hand-selected a court to convict him. However, after being beat with a whip 40 times, he died in prison. All things one day have to come to an end, and several years later, in the year 1725, Peter the Great died at the age of 52. Russian legend says he died from sickness after rescuing several soldiers from drowning in a river. However, it is 100% more likely he died in the far less glorious way of a bladder infection. Peter the Great is one of my favorite historical figures because he brings up important questions when debating the greatness of leaders. He is unquestionably influential and effective and accomplished many great things for his nation. He built up one of the largest cities in the world, began Russia's path to westernization and industrialization, expanded his empire into key areas, built up Russia's navy to a force to be reckoned with. However, the way he accomplished these goals was through violence, cruelty, and oppression. He killed and tortured his own child. He ordered a society to abandon its culture and its way of life, mocked the country's primary religion, and above all else, he was a warmonger. However, the time period Peter lived in was incredibly different from ours. What was seen as justified then is completely abhorrent now. Can we really judge a man from the 17th century by the standards of our modern time? Should we focus more on the achievements of leaders, while keeping the way they accomplish them as an afterthought? Please leave your opinions in the comments section, and tell me how I can improve my videos. Thank you so much for watching.